We start this, the fourth part of our journey through the Bible, through God's story, on a bit of a high. We'd seen God, haven't we, create this new people called Israel as part fulfillment of the covenant promise he'd made with Abraham. Promised to build a great nation in a good land as a blessing to the world. We'd also seen that people fashioned into a worshipping community centered in the very presence of God himself in the tabernacle, and given the code to live by to make them a holy nation, a royal priesthood when they do arrive in and settle their promised land. We stopped just short of Deuteronomy. That's a crime in itself, but we've got to keep moving. Deuteronomy is essentially the final sermons of Moses. The people are on the edge of the lands. They're about to go in, and Moses reminds them of all which God has done, all which God has said, and all which God has commanded them. So we turn the page into today's portion of Scripture with bated breath. Surely now, after all this time, they're about to go into the land, take possession of this glorious inheritance, and settle a faithful, worshipping, holy people of promise in the place they're promised. And that is initially how the book of Joshua opens. After Moses' death, Joshua is commissioned to take his place as leader of Israel with these quite remarkable words. This is Joshua chapter 1, reading verses 2 to 6. God says to him, "Cross the Jordan." That's the river which forms the natural eastern boundary of the promised land. "Cross the Jordan, you and all this people, into the land I am giving to them, to the Israelites. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, as I promised to Moses. No one shall be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall put this people in possession of the land that I swore to their ancestors to give them." What a promise. It's a command to go, to enter in and take this land. But far more, it's a promise that God has already taken the land for them. Imagine for a moment standing next to Joshua, listening to these words. Every place you step upon, I've already given it to you. And all of this because it's what I promised long ago. Strong, stirring, confidence-building stuff, isn't it? And that's how it goes. The people get ready, they spy out the land, they experience another startlingly miraculous water crossing, this time as those carrying the most holy artifact from the tabernacle, a box called the Ark of the Covenant. As they step into the waters of the Jordan, the river stops and the water piles up in a great heap. So again, they can cross over on dry land. Then they're in. They've arrived. The elders set up 12 stones, one for each of the 12 tribes of Israel, as a memorial, if you like, of God's great power, seen in that dramatic river crossing. The new generation receives circumcision. That's the sign of the covenant which God gave to Abraham. And eventually, it's funny, the Bible almost mentions it just in passing, but at the end of Joshua 5, they celebrate the Passover, that most holy meal in which they've yearly marked the rescue from Egypt. This is it. This is what everything's been building towards, a holy covenant people worshipping God according to his set feasts and festivals in the land he's promised to them. It is a truly wonderful moment. The only task remaining then is to take control of the land, for of course, other peoples already live there. Now, if you were ever in Sunday school or in children's church, I'm sure you will know the story of Jericho. A strong and fortified city on a hill, well prepared against external assault. And yet the Israelites triumph, not because of their overwhelming military strength, but simply by walking around the city for 7 days and then blowing their trumpets. At the sound of the trumpets, the walls fell and the city was instantly destroyed. It's a really unexpected moment, but it's actually yet another visual aid for something we missed when we missed out Moses' Deuteronomy sermons. You see, one of his most common themes was to urge the people to remember. Moses knew the hearts of his people. He knew that human beings always tend to complacency. He saw that when they entered the land, it wouldn't likely be very long before they imagined they'd earned this place. They'd fought for it, they deserved it, they'd created this for themselves. When of course none of that was true, was it? When they were in the land, they were going to need to remember they were in the land because God brought them in. When they were enjoying the fruit of the vine in the land, they needed to remember it was God who planted those vines. When they were doing anything in the land, they needed to remember it was all God's free gift of grace to them. So the conquering of the first major city, Jericho, well, that happened in such a way that it was every bit as clear that God was the one doing the conquering as it was clear that God had done that piling up of the waters of the Jordan to get them into the land so far. This was God doing what God had promised to Joshua. Everywhere the sole of his foot treads, God had given to him already. It's been absolutely all God's doing to get them into the land, hasn't it? And the conquest of Jericho was clearly the first sign that now that they're here, it's still going to be absolutely all of God's doing as they seek to settle the land. This is good. This is strong. This is the fulfillment of God's promise to his people. And yet, despite all this promise, our word for this part of our adventure really has to be apostasy. Apostasy, a turning away, a falling away, an abandonment even of God's good and perfect promises. Did you hear the commission to Joshua? Just go. I've done it all, says God. But the very next verse after I finished reading earlier on is crucial. Just go. I've done it all, says God. That's not in doubt. I'll never go back on my word. But Joshua 1 verse 7, only be strong and very courageous, being careful to act in accordance with all the law that my servant Moses commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, so that you may be successful wherever you go. When you're in, first of all, remember. Remember, I got you in. This was all my power. But then live how I've told you to live. Be that holy and worshipping community which Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy was describing. I haven't rescued you from Egypt to live as you please. I rescued you to live as my people. Yet tragically, as soon as Jericho is conquered, we already see people turning from the way God has taught them to the right or to the left, ignoring his commands, choosing instead their own paths, apostasy, a falling away. The next city to be taken is called Ai, and here the people are commanded to take nothing for themselves which God has devoted to destruction. But, well, somebody does. It's a clear command, it's a clear violation, and it's the first sign of apostasy in the land. Achan, the guilty party, is revealed. He's condemned and he dies for his sin. We might hope that's a sign grim and visible enough to warn others off following in his footsteps. We might imagine that witnessing this would be sufficient to keep Israel on the straight and narrow. And yet what we find as the book of Joshua proceeds is that, yes, broadly, they do follow the Lord. They do enter and conquer the cities, but they never fully implement the decrees of Yahweh. Go into the land, says God, but do not turn from my words to the right or the left. Yet as we turn the pages of this story, we find ever more startling diversions to every form of right and left we might imagine. One of the key issues is that the pagan people who already lived here in Canaan worshipped other gods. Why is that a problem? Well, that's a problem because the Israelites, remember, were supposed to be a visual aid to the rest of the world of their God, of Yahweh. But there'll be a fairly poor visual aid if Yahweh has to share the same territory as these other false gods. Worse, God knows the worship and practices associated with the false gods will soon become assimilated into Israelite life too. So the emphasis on holiness, on purity, that remains. The land must be rid of the pagan shrines and the practices, or the people of Yahweh won't be fulfilling the purpose of blessing the world for which they were called. And yet over and over again in the story which unfolds, that's what they don't do. They might install worship of Yahweh, but they don't expunge worship of Baal or the Ashtaroth. And so as we step into the book of Judges, we find them living out a never-ending cycle of apostasy and deliverance. You see, what happens each time their heads are turned to the right or to the left by another people, another god, another priority, each time their hearts cool toward the one who's brought them out of Egypt and into the land with many signs and wonders, great and dreadful. In short, each time they fail to remember it's all God, each time they forget, well, God doesn't leave them, but he pulls back his hand and allows another nation to invade, to take control, to begin oppressing Israel again. Of course, that should be, shouldn't it, a reminder of Egypt, the time they were slaves, the very thing God, and unmistakably God, rescued them from. But they're slow to learn, so they keep returning here. When eventually they cry out to him for help, for rescue, he sends a new leader, a judge, people like Deborah or Gideon or Samson, names you might know. The judge comes, the judge takes the nation in hand, re-establishes God's order, and for a while all is good. But then, bit by bit, tiny piece of cultural assimilation by tiny piece of cultural assimilation, smidgen of blending in by smidgen of blending in, well, they fall away again, and the whole cycle repeats itself. In fact, it's worse, because if their original transgression is initially quite small, well, the regular practice of apostasy seems to numb them against the realities of what they're doing. So the next time a judge dies and they're left leaderless, they don't just do what they did before, they do it more, worse, stronger. So if you read the book carefully and look at these cycles of falling away and being rescued, falling away when a judge dies, being delivered and re-established by a new judge, well, put together, these cycles really form a downward spiral. Remember Leviticus? The tabernacle holiness and the national holiness, the virtual circle? Well, by the end of Judges, there's a religious chaos. Those tabernacle laws almost out of functional sight. One particular Israelite, this is Judges chapter 17, he's stolen money from his own mother. He's used that to cast a silver god for him and his family to worship. And he's employed a Levite from the priestly tribe to come and be his own private household priest. This is not the ordered, tabernacle-oriented worship people of Exodus are supposed to follow, is it? But so too there's moral chaos as well. Now in Judges 19, another Levite, he's taken a concubine. That in itself should be outrageous enough. And yet when he travels to a neighbouring town, and the men of that town want to have sex with him, he offers them his concubine instead, and Certificate 18 warning, they literally rape her until she's dead. This is supposed to be God's holy people. These are the people God has rescued from Egypt. They are in the land he gave to them of his free and gracious gift. But what have they done? They've not remembered. They've not remembered any of that. Each has gone his own way, right or left, until we finally reach at the end of the book and the devastating assessment of Judges chapter 21, verse 25. In those days, there was no king, no leader in all Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. The people of Israel, this precious people to whom God has personally revealed himself, amongst whom he physically dwells in the tabernacle. This redeemed people who've witnessed the kind and scale of mighty, miraculous deliverance, which, incidentally, Joshua tells us, has all the surrounding nations trembling. This people who were supposed to live the perfect response of a worshipping and holy life, centered on Yahweh and channeling his blessing to the rest of the world. They've revealed the innate pull within every human heart. Each rescued and redeemed heart, surely, but each nevertheless still broken and fallen heart, which is to fashion God in our own image. So far from the heights of hope with which this chapter of God's story began, we're now perhaps at its lowest depth so far. We know how it should be: holy, worshipping, knowing God and his blessing. We know how that should be achieved simply by the simple act of remembering who God is, remembering what God has done. And yet here we are, all the people doing what was right in their own eyes, and wondering what can possibly pull things together from here.